The rain hammered against the bulletproof windows of Vincent LaRue's Chicago penthouse as he stared at the financial report that had kept him awake for 3 nights. Café Lumière, his tribute to the Parisian cafés where his late mother once worked, was falling apart. Complaints spoke of hostility and neglect, and everything he read told him something was deeply wrong. Before we continue, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like the video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Now let's continue. At 38, Vincent had everything except what mattered. His hospitality empire spanned 4 continents, his wealth beyond measure. Yet alone in his marble penthouse, surrounded by meaningless awards and crushing silence, he felt the cost of success. Going undercover was both a business decision and a desperate search for the man he used to be. Jane Mitchell's alarm screamed at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before she actually needed to wake up. Those 13 minutes were her daily insurance policy against the chaos of single motherhood, the buffer between managing and drowning. She silenced it quickly, listening for sounds from Oliver's room. Nothing. Good. Let him sleep while he could. The kitchen table had become her war room. She sorted bills into 3 piles. Pay immediately, pay soon, and pray they'll wait. The electric company went in pile 1. Oliver's school field trip permission slip, requiring a $40 fee she didn't have, went in pile 3. Rent, due in 12 days, stared at her from pile 2 like a ticking bomb. Her tips from last week sat in an envelope marked emergency. $263 that represented every smile she'd forced, every rude customer she'd tolerated, every aching hour on her feet. It wasn't nearly enough. "Mama," Oliver's sleepy voice carried from his doorway. At 7, he already had his father's dark curls and his mother's questioning eyes. "Why are you doing math so early?" "Just organizing, baby. Come here." Jane pulled him onto her lap, breathing in the strawberry scent of the discount shampoo they'd splurged on last week. These morning moments were sacred, calm before whatever storm waited at Café Lumière. "Mama, can I ask you something?" Oliver's voice carried that careful tone that meant he'd been thinking about this for a while. "Always. Why can't I go to Jeremy's birthday party at the trampoline place? His mom said it's only $25. Jane's heart cracked. $25. A nothing amount to most families. An impossible luxury to hers. "Baby, we've talked about this. We have to be smart with our money right now. Because Daddy left and didn't send the checks?" 7 years old and already understanding abandonment. Jane pulled him closer. "Because Mama's building us a better future. Sometimes that means waiting for the fun stuff. Jeremy said his dad says you're poor because you didn't try hard enough." The words hit like a slap, but Jane kept her voice steady. "Jeremy's dad doesn't know our story, sweetheart. We're not poor. We're smart, we're strong, and we're going to be just fine." She got Oliver ready for school, packed the lunch she'd carefully assembled from sale items, and walked him to the bus stop. As he climbed aboard, waving with innocent trust that she'd fix everything, Jane felt the familiar weight settle on her shoulders. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus Holloway, the operations manager. "Remember our conversation about loyalty, Jane? I'd hate for you to make choices that affect your circumstances. See you at your shift." Her hands trembled as she read it twice. Yesterday, she'd questioned why her paycheck was $37 short again. Marcus had cornered her in the supply closet, his expensive cologne suffocating in the small space, his voice soft and dangerous. Single mothers in your position can't afford to ask too many questions, especially when they have sons who walk to school every morning. The threat had been crystal clear. Jane deleted the text and checked her bus schedule. She had exactly 43 minutes to decide if keeping her job was worth keeping silent about the theft, the fear, and the corruption she'd been documenting in secret for 3 months. 43 minutes to choose between survival and truth. Vincent pulled the black baseball cap lower as he pushed through the glass door of Café Lumière. The bell chimed, a sound he'd personally selected to evoke Parisian charm, but the atmosphere it announced was anything but charming. The lunch rush was in full swing, yet the energy felt wrong. Servers moved with visible reluctance, their smiles dropping the moment they turned from customers. A busboy cleared tables with his eyes down, shoulders hunched like he expected a blow. Behind the counter, a young hostess scrolled her phone while a line of customers waited, unacknowledged. This wasn't just poor service. This was fear. Vincent chose a corner booth near the window, positioning himself to observe everything. The cafe's design was exactly as he'd envisioned. Exposed brick, warm lighting, vintage photographs of Paris lining the walls. His mother would have loved it. But the soul was missing, replaced by something that made his skin crawl. Coffee. The voice was professional, but carried an undertone of exhaustion. Vincent looked up and found himself face to face with a woman whose presence seemed to shift the air around her. Late 20s, with intelligent dark eyes that held too much weariness for someone so young. Her name tag read, Jane, and unlike the other staff, her burgundy uniform was immaculate despite what he suspected were impossible circumstances. Please. Black. For just a fraction of a second, her eyes widened. It was so quick he almost missed it, a flash of recognition that sent his pulse racing. She knew. Somehow, despite the cap, the worn jeans, the carefully constructed disguise, she knew exactly who he was. Coming right up, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Vincent watched her walk away, his mind spinning. How? His face rarely appeared in local media, and when it did, he was always in tailored suits with styled hair. Today he looked like any construction worker on break. When she returned, Jane's hands trembled slightly as she set down the white ceramic cup. The movement was professional, practiced, unremarkable to anyone watching. But as she placed the cup on its saucer, she smoothly slid something underneath, a small piece of paper folded tight. Their eyes met for just a moment. In that brief connection, Vincent saw everything. Terror, desperation, and a courage that took his breath away. I know who you are, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the cafe's ambient noise. They're stealing everything. Crown Fountain, 9 p.m. Come alone. Please. Then she straightened, her professional mask sliding back into place. Can I get you anything else? Vincent's throat felt dry. His heart hammered against his ribs. Just the check when you get a chance. Of course. She walked away, and Vincent forced himself to wait a full 30 seconds before carefully extracting the note from beneath his cup. He kept it low, hidden from view, and unfolded it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was neat, feminine, urgent. Marcus Holloway is stealing from you. Ghost employees. Supplier kickbacks. Tip theft. Your people are scared. I have proof. Crown Fountain tonight, 9 p.m. Come alone. They're watching everyone. Jay? Vincent read it twice, his coffee growing cold. Every instinct screamed questions. Who was she? Why risk this? Was it legitimate or some elaborate setup? But beneath the business analysis, something else stirred. A profound respect for the woman who'd just risked everything to reach him. Across the cafe, he caught glimpses of a tall man in an expensive suit emerging from the back office. Mid-40s, silver hair, cold blue eyes that swept the dining room like a predator surveying territory. When those eyes lingered on Jane, Vincent saw her shoulders tense imperceptibly. Marcus Holloway. Vincent paid his check in cash and left, the note burning like evidence against his chest. As he walked to his rental car, one thought repeated in his mind. A complete stranger had just turned his world upside down. Tonight at 9, he'd find out why. The blue glow of the Crown Fountain flickered against the night, the giant LED faces of Chicago's citizens blinking slowly as water cascaded down their digital cheeks. It was a cold, rhythmic backdrop for a conversation that felt like a slow-motion collision. Jane reached into her bag, her fingers trembling slightly, and pulled out the thick manila envelope. She didn't hand it to him immediately. She held it against her chest like a shield. I didn't do this for a promotion, Vincent, she whispered, her breath blooming in the winter air. I did it because if I didn't, the entire pension fund for the Northside Division disappears by spring. When she finally surrendered the documents, Vincent scanned them under the harsh street lamps. His face, usually a mask of polished corporate steel, fractured. The numbers were undeniable. Marcus hadn't just been skimming. He had built a labyrinth of shell companies designed to hollow out the firm from the inside. The sheer scale of the betrayal, happening right under Vincent's nose, left him momentarily breathless. He looked from the ledgers to Jane, seeing the dark circles under her eyes and the way she scanned the shadows of Millennium Park, expecting a predator to emerge at any moment. She had risked her livelihood and her son's safety for a sense of justice he hadn't realized still existed in his world. "You'll have the best security I can hire," Vincent said, his voice dropping an octave, thick with a sudden, fierce protectiveness. "And the firm's full legal resources. I won't let him touch you." Jane let out a sharp, jagged laugh that held no humor. "Resources? Protection? That's how people like you solve problems, Vincent. But I've spent my life learning that promises are just words people use until the situation becomes inconvenient." The gap between them felt wider than the plaza. He was a man who moved mountains with a phone call. She was a woman who had survived by assuming the mountain would eventually fall on her. Yet, as the silence stretched, a different kind of tension took hold. Vincent saw in her the same hollow ache he felt in his glass-walled penthouse. The exhaustion of being the only person who cared, the crushing weight of a life built on vigilance rather than connection. He spoke of his own losses, the people who had exited his life the moment the money wasn't enough to keep them, and Jane found herself listening. They were two ghosts haunting a city of millions, bound together by the sudden, terrifying realization that they were no longer alone in the dark. The following morning, the pristine glass of the boardrooms felt like a cage to Vincent. He spent his hours vetting the shell companies Jane had identified, his fingers flying over keys while his mind remained anchored to that cold park bench. To maintain cover, he kept his distance, but by evening, the clinical detachment he had mastered over a decade began to crumble. He found himself driving to her neighborhood, a part of Chicago where the streetlights hummed with a yellow, dying buzz and the wind rattled the loose siding of cramped apartment buildings. Seeing Jane in her own world was a visceral shock. He watched from the curb as she walked from the bus stop, her frame slight against the biting wind, carrying a bag of groceries that looked too heavy for her tired arms. When she reached her son, Oliver, the boy's worn coat, cuffs frayed and a size too small, twisted something deep in Vincent's chest. This wasn't a case file anymore. It was the quiet, daily desperation of a woman holding a universe together with sheer will. He felt a surge of protective instinct that terrified him, a heat that bypassed his logic and settled into his bones. Jane felt the shift, too. When they met briefly in the office break room later that week, she didn't just see a CEO with an untouchable pedigree. She saw the way his jaw tightened when he looked at her, the genuine haunting in his eyes that spoke of a man who had everything but belonged nowhere. For a fleeting second, his wealth felt like a burden he was tired of carrying alone. But the fragile understanding was shattered when Marcus intercepted her near the elevators. He didn't yell. He leaned in close, the scent of his expensive cologne clashing with the sterile office air. "You've been distracted lately, Jane," Marcus murmured, his smile not reaching his eyes. "A mother in your position can't afford to be careless. People who lose focus in this building tend to lose everything else, too. Think about Oliver." The mention of her son's name felt like a physical blow. Her blood ran cold, her pulse hammering against her throat as Marcus walked away with a casual wave. When she relayed the encounter to Vincent in a frantic, coded message, the reality of the situation finally settled over him like a shroud. Standard corporate audits and HR investigations were too slow, too tethered to a system Marcus already knew how to manipulate. If he waited for the board to act, Jane and her son would pay the price. Vincent realized then that to save her, he would have to step outside the lines he had spent his whole life drawing. The lock didn't resist when Jane turned her key, and that was the first sign of the nightmare. It swung open with a hollow click, revealing a space that looked untouched at first glance. But as she stepped inside with Oliver, the silence felt heavy, poisoned. Her eyes darted to the kitchen table. Her laptop was still there, and her jewelry box sat undisturbed on the dresser. Then she saw it. A single chair moved to the center of the living room, facing the front door, and a small, plastic toy soldier belonging to Oliver placed neatly on the seat. It was a silent declaration of presence. Nothing was stolen because the intruder wanted her to know that her privacy, her sanctuary, and her life were worth nothing to them. Oliver's hand tightened in hers, his small face pale as he looked at the toy. "Mommy, why is Mr. Brave on the chair?" His voice trembled, a high, thin sound that cut through Jane's chest. "Is the bad man coming back?" The walls Jane had built around her heart for years, the steel-plated resolve of a single mother who needed no one, simply vanished. She didn't call the police. She knew Marcus's reach, and she knew the slow grind of bureaucracy would only leave them sitting ducks in a crime scene. With shaking hands, she dialed Vincent. He arrived in less than 20 minutes, the tires of his black sedan screeching against the curb. When he burst through the door, he didn't look like the titan of industry who graced the covers of magazines. His tie was gone, his sleeves were rolled up, and his face was etched with a raw, jagged fury. He didn't ask for a report or a list of missing items. He took one look at Jane's shattered expression and the way Oliver was hiding behind her legs, and he simply reached out, his hands steady as he gripped her shoulders. "Pack a bag. Just the essentials," Vincent commanded, his voice a low, vibrating tether to reality. "You aren't staying here another minute." He didn't delegate the task to a security firm or send a car. He personally carried their bags to the car, his movements fueled by an instinct so primal it bypassed every calculated strategy he had ever learned. As they drove toward a private, high-security residence he kept in the Gold Coast, a fortress of limestone and reinforced glass, the silence in the car was thick with a new truth. The investigation into Marcus's fraud was no longer a corporate necessity or a moral crusade. It was a secondary thought. As Vincent glanced in the rearview mirror at the woman and child in his back seat, the line between his professional duty and his personal soul dissolved entirely. They were his now, and the world would have to burn before he let that bad man near them again. The limestone walls of the Gold Coast estate offered a silence so profound it was almost deafening. Inside, Vincent stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the dark churn of Lake Michigan. He knew the playbook for a crisis of this magnitude: alert the board, convene the legal counsel, and initiate a multi-month internal audit. It was the safe, sterilized way to handle Marcus. But as he turned to see Jane sitting on the edge of a plush velvet sofa, her eyes wide and scanning the room as if waiting for the shadows to move, he knew the corporate protocol was a death sentence. To wait for the board was to leave her exposed to Marcus's desperation. For the first time in his career, Vincent abandoned the balance sheet. He didn't call the firm's lawyers. Instead, he activated a private network of investigators and digital forensic experts, men who operated in the gray areas where Marcus lived. He was no longer using his wealth to acquire assets. He was using it as a weapon and a shield. The shift from billionaire to protector was visceral, a shedding of the cold skin he had worn for a decade. Jane watched this transformation with a mixture of awe and trepidation. She saw him not as a distant titan, but as a man who sat on the floor of the library to help Oliver build a Lego set because the boy was too anxious to sleep. She began to breathe again, the tight knot in her chest loosening enough for her to speak of things she had buried, her fear that she had failed as a mother by putting them in this position, and her quiet, resilient dreams of a life where she didn't have to look over her shoulder. Oliver, sensing the change in the air, drifted toward Vincent with the guileless gravity of a child. He asked Vincent questions about the stars and the city, his small hand occasionally brushing Vincent's sleeve. For Vincent, the contact was like an electric shock to a heart he thought had gone numb. He was terrified by the vulnerability this child brought out in him, yet he found himself leaning into it, a healing process he hadn't known he needed. While the sanctuary of the estate felt like a new world, the clock was ticking in the old one. Across the city, Marcus was no longer playing a game of cat and mouse. He had seen the empty apartment, and realized his leverage was gone. Driven by a volatile mix of greed and panic, he began liquidating the remaining accounts, accelerating his timeline to vanish with the stolen millions. He was no longer looking for a way to stay. He was looking for a way to burn the bridge behind him, regardless of who was still standing on it. The predator was finally cornered, and like any cornered animal, Marcus went for the throat. The burner phone in Jane's hand felt like a live wire as Marcus's voice, devoid of its usual oily charm, hissed through the receiver. He didn't want the money anymore. He wanted her silence, and he was willing to trade Oliver's future for it. Leave the city tonight, Jane. Disappear, or I'll make sure the boy is the one who pays for your conscience. Jane's resolve shattered in an instant. The justice she had fought for, the evidence she had painstakingly gathered, it all meant nothing compared to the warmth of her son's hand in hers. She was ready to run, to surrender, to let the corruption win if it meant Oliver remained safe. She turned to Vincent, her eyes wild with a mother's primal terror, expecting him to offer a strategic retreat or a legal compromise. Instead, Vincent stepped into the light. He didn't offer a corporate platitude. He offered himself. He knew that returning to the safety of his boardrooms would be the end of them, and for the first time in his life, the profit and loss statement of his soul was clear. He chose them. He chose love over the suffocating safety of his isolation. The confrontation took place at Café Lumière, a quiet spot that now felt like a stage for a tragedy. Marcus arrived expecting a broken woman ready to sign away her life. He didn't expect to find Vincent sitting there, calm and terrifyingly resolute. Behind the scenes, the digital net had closed. The FBI was patched into the room, recording every word of Marcus's desperate extortion. When Marcus realized the trap, the mask of the executive fell away, revealing the monster beneath. He lunged for Jane, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward him as a human shield, his eyes darting for an exit. It was the final straw. The polished CEO, the man of refined manners and billion-dollar handshakes, vanished. Vincent moved with a raw, unscripted fury, stepping into Marcus's space and forcing a physical confrontation that had nothing to do with corporate hierarchy. It was a messy, desperate struggle, a man fighting for the family he had accidentally found. As the authorities swarmed the cafe and the handcuffs clicked around Marcus's wrists, the silence that followed was transformative. The criminal network was in ruins, and the headlines would soon tell a story of corporate heroism. But as Vincent stood there, his chest heaving and his knuckles bruised, he didn't look at the agents or the crowd. He looked at Jane and Oliver. The real victory wasn't the arrest or the saved millions. It was the fact that a man who had lived behind glass walls had finally stepped out into the air, choosing the messy, terrifying vulnerability of being human. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Café Lumière, casting a soft, golden light across the polished mahogany tables. The air no longer carried the sharp scent of tension or the heavy silence of secrets. Instead, it smelled of roasted beans and the quiet, steady hum of a community in repair. The cafe had reopened not just with a new coat of paint, but with a new soul. Under Vincent's radical restructuring, the hierarchy that had once shielded men like Marcus had been dismantled. Employee ownership programs and fair wage initiatives were no longer radical theories. They were the foundation of a business empire being rebuilt from the ground up, one life at a time. Jane sat at a corner table, a notebook for her culinary school courses open beside her. The weight that had rounded her shoulders for years had finally lifted, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. Her presence there, and Oliver's placement in a school where he finally felt safe to be a child, wasn't a matter of charity. It was a recognition of her worth, a debt of honor Vincent had insisted on settling. She was no longer a ghost in the machine. She was the architect of her own future. When Vincent walked through the door, he didn't command the room with the cold gravity of a titan. He moved with a lightness that felt earned. He took the seat across from Jane, and for a long moment, they simply watched the city move outside the window. He had learned that the true measure of a man wasn't the height of his towers, but the depth of the security he could provide for those who had nothing. He had traded his isolation for the terrifying, beautiful complexity of being present. Nearby, Oliver sat with a sketchbook, occasionally looking up to flash a toothy grin at Vincent, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had healed them both. The boy had learned that while bad men exist, they do not win, and that courage is often found in the people who choose to stay when things get dark. "I never thought a cup of coffee could taste like this," Jane said softly, her eyes meeting Vincent's. There was no longer a gap of wealth or status between them, only the shared history of a storm they had survived together. The air between them hummed with an unspoken promise, a delicate thread of something deeper that didn't need to be hurried or defined. They had both entered the darkness looking for a way to survive, only to find the one thing neither had known they were searching for, a sense of belonging. As the cafe filled with the sounds of a new day, they sat together in the quiet victory of a life lived out in the light.